Hi, I'm Stephen Davis, author of Truthteller, an investigative reporter's journey through the world of truth prevention, fake news, and conspiracy theories. And I'm talking to Jill B. on So Booking Call.
Welcome to So Booking Cool. It's Jill B. Today's guest is a multi-award-winning investigative reporter of 3 decades. He's produced for 60 Minutes in 2020, and he has created and taught journalism programs for thousands of students. His new book, Truthteller, an investigative reporter's journey through the world of truth prevention, fake news, and conspiracy theories, comes out this May. He is Stephen Davis.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Stephen. I'm very well. How are things going?
They're going well. Been hectic on my book too, and it's generating a lot of interest, so that's good.
Yes. And you essentially wrote your book, Truthteller. I know one of the reasons is for people who don't want to get lost in the noise. So what does it mean to be lost in the noise versus not being lost in the noise?
I think a lot of people now are lost in the huge volumes of information circulating on social media. It's really hard to get even think about the vast numbers. Somebody was saying to me recently there's research which shows that every year 90% of the information created in the whole of human history circulates on social media. So we have a vast quantity of information. Sadly, more and more of it is false. It circulates the world at tremendous speeds. There's a study which shows that, quite an authoritative study which shows that falsehoods circulate more quickly than the truth. And the people whose job was to be the gatekeepers to help sort this out, journalists, my profession, there's fewer of us around.
Like you said, more of the stories that are false are the ones that seem to spread around. What kind of truths do you think are the ones that typically fly under the radar?
Well, in the book Truthteller, I list a number of techniques for disinformation and misinformation, which are used, by the way, by, dictatorships and also by politicians in the West. And they know they can get away with it because, often people don't even read to the end of a tweet before sharing it. They can't get to the bottom of 140 characters. Or they'll share something on Facebook without thinking about it. And there are a number of techniques used by people to capitalize on this. One I describe in the book is called the big lie, and it's something that both Putin and Trump use. The idea is that our brains are wired to treat as trustworthy information that's familiar to us. That's logical if you think about it. So here's what they do. They tell a big lie. Initially, a lot of people might not believe it, but then they repeat it again and again and again, and you can track the numbers. More and more people believe it, the more often you discuss it.
So what are in addition to the big lie, what are some of the truths that readers can expect to uncover from Truthteller?
I explain a very modern technique of creating conspiracy theories, generating conspiracy theories to cover up an actual conspiracy theory. An example in Truthteller is when Skripal, a former Russian intelligence officer, was poisoned in the United Kingdom, and it seemed pretty clear from the evidence that the Russians had done it. I was tracking that story. Within 10 days, 4 completely different conspiracy theories were generated online about what happened. So now if you look back a year or two later and research this, you look and see, okay, there's 5 different versions of the story. Do I really know what to believe? What a very, very effective technique to cover up a crime.
Yes, because I know also you have also uncovered a murder that took place in Antarctica, I believe. Was it Antarctica? Or was it?
Yes, this is a very interesting U.S. story. The book Truthteller has stories from all over the world, but in this case, it's a possible murder. Here's what happened. A scientist died in mysterious circumstances at South Pole Station. And the investigation into this was really blocked by the US authorities. The investigation fell into the hands of New Zealand police because Christchurch in New Zealand is where people go back and forth to the Antarctic from. The Antarctica, of course, is a kind of extraterritorial place with no governing law. When the New Zealand police tried to find out what happened, they were really blocked at every turn. For instance, evidence was destroyed at the scene. When they wanted to question witnesses, they were made to send off a questionnaire, and they got very few replies back. All of the witnesses to what happened eventually flew back to the United States without doing anything. Now, it may be that the circumstances that this man died were accidental, but the point is it was so successfully covered up that we'll never know. Partially, I think, because the US authorities wanted to preserve the kind of pristine image of life in Antarctica, you know, this pure, gorgeous white space that people went down to do pure scientific research. In fact, in Truthteller, my investigation into life there's often there's huge alcohol problems, there's drug problems, there's a lot of random sex, there are a lot of fights that break out between people who then have to be evacuated from the ice. It really is quite an extraordinary story.
Wow. You did mention scientists, and I know that you have uncovered scientists who were not being completely truthful. What kinds of things typically do you think scientists might be hiding?
Well, I mean, this is in the realms of speculation, but one of the great areas of misinformation and disinformation worldwide now is, of course, the distortion of science and fake science news circulating, fake medical news circulating, not necessarily done by the scientists themselves, but the trouble is online now. You can look at sites and news stories that look real, that look like they're created by some actual organization, and they're actually just created by some clever computer geek in his basement.
What is your opinion on people who try to avoid the news because they feel like it's constantly depressing?
Well, if you try and avoid the news, you're actually just playing into the hands of the people who want to get away with lying to you. You know, we can't opt out of society. We can be frustrated, and we should be frustrated by the levels of misinformation and disinformation, but the way to tackle that is to demand better information, to demand better journalism, to demand and hold our politicians accountable. I believe really the solution is education. I think in about 10 years' time, this problem will have got so bad that everybody will be teaching at schools and high schools and universities media literacy, and it'll be regarded as important as science or maths or English. Teaching people to be ethical consumers and sharers of information, because after all, if you pass on a falsehood, you are partially complicit in the crime. You may say to yourself, well, I didn't create this and it seemed quite interesting and fun and I'll just send it on to the next person. But do we all really want to be part of just a long string of people around the world sending misinformation around the world? I don't think so.
Mm-hmm. And just out of curiosity, do you think that the news, I love that the news does report, when they do report what's happening in the world, because of course it's not always going to be, happy or glamorous or joyous, but do you think that the news could do more to report positive stories?
All journalists have the experience of being asked this by people, and I've been asked this constantly in my 30 years of journalism, and there have been attempts, by the way, to set up media organizations that only reported good news, and you know what? Mm-hmm. They went bust, most of them. The simple truth of the matter is news is often something that's alarming that needs to be the public attention. If I said to you, Jill, today 1,000 planes flew around the world and nothing happened, you simply wouldn't be interested. If I said to you a plane crashed, you would be interested. I think we have to strike a balance between informing people of developments in society which may be positive. Yes, we can do more about that, and I know news organizations try, but really it's like, if you go to work one day and you have a normal day and come home, there's not much interesting in that, is it? What's interesting is if something different happens to you.
Okay, yes. I was having a conversation recently, and I just want to know your take on this, of course, with you being a veteran in the journalism field. So what would make it newsworthy? For example, let's say the story is that there is a new bakery opening up in town, in a neighborhood. What would make it newsworthy, do you think, for somebody to want to do a story on this new bakery that's opening up?
Well, local media will cover events like that. Local media will cover new businesses starting up, but the reality is there has to be something unusual about it. It might be somebody who has come back from the war and is a veteran and has struggled with life and now has decided to reinvent themselves as a baker. You see, that would be a story. Or somebody who had suffered deprivations in their life and pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and now was starting their own business. Or the business could have been launched as a result of help from a charity or a philanthropist. All those things would be stories. Of course, just the act of opening a business in itself is probably not a story. I have to say local media do look for positive stories, but here's the unfortunate thing. Facebook, as well as being, I think, the most socially irresponsible company in the world now, an actual publisher and broadcaster which refuses to let itself be treated as a publisher and broadcaster, Facebook has also destroyed local journalism through its greed. It used to be said that when print advertising disappeared, it would be replaced by digital advertising. But what's happened is that Facebook and Google have taken all that. So they've really done a lot of damage to society.
So when did journalism become important to you, and how did you know that with the different types of beats that exist in the field that investigative was for you? Investigative reporting.
Yes. I actually have a school report written when I was 10 years old, and it says, Stephen wants to be a journalist but will need to improve his English. So I did the one. I'm still working on my English, obviously. But yes, for some reason I always wanted to be a reporter. I looked at things like, I'm interested in sports. Maybe I should be a sports reporter. But then when I was young, I went to see the movie All the President's Men about Woodward and Bernstein and how they took down Richard Nixon. And at that moment, I decided I wanted to be an investigative reporter. And I guess there's something about my personality which means I like tough challenges. I like to try and find out a story that somebody doesn't want me to find out.
What mistakes do you think that you commonly see rising journalists make, and what were some of the mistakes that you made early on in your career?
Early on in my career, I did not realize that developing a source would be such a long and complicated business. It's a relationship of trust. At the end of the day, to get the big stories, the real stories, trying to persuade people to tell you things that sometimes they're not supposed to tell you. Things about their life in a corporation or government or the military or whatever. So I had to learn to be patient, not to rush into a story, sometimes to spend months or years. I mean, there are several sources in the book Truthteller. There's a source who's a British intelligence officer working for MI6. There's another source from the CIA. There's another source from a special forces group. These are people I've known and developed slowly for years. The mistake young journalists make, well, partially it's not their fault. They're stuck in the office too often. They have too much to do. They're on social media, so they don't get out and interview people in person. By far the most effective way to talk to a fellow human being is sitting with them in person, making eye contact, developing trust, not talking to them on the phone.
Okay. Why do you think a lot of media outlets and journalism outlets don't really give the staff a chance to go out there and be reporters on the field?
It's a resource issue, simple as that.
Okay.
There are fewer, journalism is a profession that needs to be paid for, good journalism. I tell my students, my students always wanted free stuff. Fair enough, they want free music, they want free stuff on the internet. I say, for journalism, if you want free stuff, you're simply going to get propaganda. If you want real journalism, which takes time and effort, you have to pay for it. And so for young reporters now, the difficulty is that they might be doing 4 stories a day, and there's no time to leave the office to develop them properly, to go out and interview people. When I started up, everybody used to have one assignment a day and a whole day to dig around, and of course then you get more information and you're more likely to get the story right.
When I was a student in journalism, I know for the school paper we had a word count, and I know that is typical for other places, but do you think that having a word count can negatively impact how you write the story?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I set papers for journalism students. I taught a lot, and sometimes to be honest, Jill, you set a word count to avoid them doing too little if they're not very dedicated students. But generally speaking, of course, a word count is a nonsensical idea. The story is worth what it's worth. There might be stories that are only worth 500 words, and there might be stories that are worth 10,000 words. There might be stories that are worth a whole series of articles. So yes, I think it's about assessing the value of the actual story.
Is it risky writing and then releasing a book like Truthteller when are there any fears about exposing certain realities?
Oh, any fears about what, sorry?
Exposing certain realities in the world, exposing, the truth.
Well, certainly journalists who dig into this thing are at risk. In Truthteller, I tell the story of the sinking of the ferry Estonia and the involvement of various groups, including the Russians in that. And I had a Russian colleague, a journalist, helping me with that story, and he had to drop out because his family was threatened. And because another colleague of his working on another story got told to go to the Moscow metro and pick up a briefcase which apparently had great secret papers in it, and he brought the briefcase back to his office, opened it up, and bam, it was a bomb and it killed him. So these things are dangerous, and of course journalists reporting in various parts of the Middle East and Africa. Journalists in Turkey get locked up, journalists in Russia get murdered, so it can be a highly dangerous job. But you've got to just stick with it and think, that the story justifies it in the end.
What is your opinion on conspiracy theories, Stephen, and are there any that have stood out to you?
Well, I'm really hot on this. Conspiracy theories people think are amusing, entertaining, interesting to pass on, but they're absolutely not. I'm here to tell you that conspiracy theories are dangerous. You and a group of friends might pass them on thinking it's a bit of fun, but all it takes is one young man sitting in a basement on a computer with access to guns, and we see, the terrible consequences of that. We saw the terrible consequences of believing in conspiracy theories in my home country in the massacre in Christchurch recently. Conspiracy theories are dangerous. They're also kind of nonsensical because I can tell you what any investigative reporter knows. People find it very difficult to keep a secret. And any conspiracy theory that involves apparently thousands of people keeping an amazing secret for years on end is just crazy, quite frankly.
Have you ever heard the conspiracy theory about the Illuminati?
Yes, well, interestingly enough, that of course was pretty much of an invention by the writer Dan Brown in his fiction. But in the recent Christchurch shooting, there was a picture of the gunman in court, and somebody claimed that he was making a sign with his hand that said he was a member of the Illuminati. But look, Jules, these are all distractions. While people are believing these and chatting about these, they're missing the real things that are happening to their society, the real things that governments and politicians are doing. That's why governments and politicians more or less like conspiracy theories, because it helps them to hide the truth.
What do you think are some trustworthy sources of media that the public can rely on, or what should they look for when they're seeking a trustworthy media outlet?
That's a good question. Well, here's one definition of a trustworthy media outlet, is one in which they're prepared to correct their mistakes. Journalism is not a perfect profession. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody gets things wrong. But the truly responsible media organizations own up to their mistakes, correct them prominently. Irresponsible ones or deceitful ones try to hide their mistakes and won't ever admit to making an error. If you did a cross-section across the world, if you subscribe to the New York Times, The Guardian, you listen to PBS, the BBC in the UK, ABC in Australia, you would have a good cross-section of reliable media. The other definition of a reliable media organization is actually to carefully check their sources before they publish it, and not just rush into print or rush online or rush to broadcast news which may not be true.
Who was the first person you told when you finished Truthteller?
Who was the first person I told?
Yeah, if you remember. It might be more than one person. I don't know.
No, well, I mean, the first person to notice I'd finished Truthteller was my wife, Penny, who had put up with me sitting in the office here in Dunedin in New Zealand for about 2 years, head down for hours on end, writing and researching the book. So, and after that, I told some close colleagues, and also, of course, this is very important, I made sure to tell the people who I quote or mention in the book or my sources that it was coming out, so they're not caught by surprise.
What does it feel like when you've finished your book? Because Truthteller is your first book.
Yes, I've been a newspaper editor, a television producer, I've made a dramatized documentary, I've done all sorts of journalism, writing and broadcasting, and I can tell you absolutely this, writing the book is by far the hardest thing that I've ever done. It's a kind of lonely job, and it requires a lot of discipline. Each day you've got to get up and say to yourself, okay, I'm going to write today. I'm not going to get distracted. I'm not going to go to my coffee machine and make another cup of coffee. I'm not going to check the news or the sports results. I'm going to stick with it and write. It really is quite hard work, and I was tremendously relieved when I finished.
Do you have plans to write another book? Have you thought about it?
Well, that's a very pertinent question. I have, in fact, just been given a contract for a second book, even before Truthteller is out. And so I'm about to embark on the tough process of researching and writing the second book. Clearly, I did not suffer enough in the first one and decided to do a second one. And the second one focuses really exclusively on what I think are the dangers done to society by out-of-control social media. So I'm writing that book, and I have a deadline of October this year, and it'll be coming out next year.
I also want to get some information on how you found your publisher, and the new book, is that with the same publisher? I know sometimes authors for the next book, they stay with the same publisher, sometimes they don't, but what can you tell us about your experience?
I was lucky to find a good local publisher here who was keen on the book, but also importantly had a distribution arrangement with a major publisher in the Northern Hemisphere. The local publisher is Exile, but the publisher in the Northern Hemisphere is a big publisher called Quarto. Because one of the things about producing a book, even if it's good and it gets good reviews, and luckily this has got good reviews so far, is actually getting it distributed around the world and getting it into bookshops. You need the help of a big company. So locally it's being done by Exile. In Australia it's being done by Exile, but in the States it's being distributed by Quarto. And that's who I'm doing the second book with.
Ah, okay. Mr. Davis, what do you want people to take away from Truthteller, and how is this book going to change lives?
I want people to read Truthteller and first and foremost to recognize the dangers of misinformation and disinformation. Secondly, to have a pretty clear idea about when they're being lied to and just decide not to be lied to. And thirdly, tell themselves as a participating member of society that I will in future be an ethical consumer and sharer of information, and I'll be careful what I pass on via Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever. That's what I'd like people to take away from it.
Stephen Davis, everyone. It was an absolute pleasure. I would love to talk with you again. Thank you for taking the time to chat with So Booking Cool today. Let everyone know how they can keep up with you and how they can get Truthteller.
Absolutely. Well, it's in U.S. bookshops. It's already available on Amazon.com. And you can follow me on Twitter on The Editor Speaks. And, I think you'll enjoy reading the book.
Absolutely. And congratulations on your second book deal, by the way.
Okay, thanks very much.
No problem. I am going to squeeze in one more question. What advice would you give a journalism teacher?
A journalism teacher? Okay, well, first off, to be honest, a few journalism teachers who used to be journalists and went into teaching have become slightly cynical about things, I find. Don't be cynical. Still fight the good fight. Still realize that journalism is of vital importance to society. After all, one of your first presidents, Thomas Jefferson, said if he was asked to choose between government and journalism, he would pick journalism every time. It's important, and you need to inspire your students to see how important it is to society and send them out into the world with a determination to find the truth.
I love that. Thank you. And
thank you.
And thank you so much to all the listeners. Until next time, So Booking Cool.